We're now on Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis, and we're establishing that Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda expands the circumference that is valid for Shechita to include even the Shar Tabos, meaning the lower rings, and the Chiddush here is a Gavaldige Chiddush because he's really expanding the circumference for Shechita and minimizing the Psul of Hagrama by including even those tabos that don't completely surround the trachea. The Eda Makifos is Hakana, but nevertheless, Makifos is Rov Hakana. Now, there's a little bit of a digression here, which it bothers me a little bit because we're going to lose the trend, but I don't have no choice. It says Mugremes Psula. Is it really true that there's a psul called Hagrama? Heyed Rab Chanina ben Antignos al Mugremes Shikshera. Okay. So anyway, we have another Tana, and they testified about that Tana Rab Chanina that he actually was Machshir Hagrama. It's like apparently, even if the entire cut is above the great ring, right? Rab Chanina defines the trachea's upper limit for shchita differently. Okay, this has to do with another part of the trachea, which is called the kova. But anyway, let's just try to get back into the flow of things. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda Tarti Komar, and Rav Shmuel Savri Kavos Bechadu Pligale Bechadu. So let's understand. We were left with a problem because Rav and Shmuel, on the one hand, paskin like Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, but yet they did not consider that these lower rings that don't completely surround the circumference of the trachea are outside of the limit of shechita. Now we said that according to Rabbi Yossi, and if you accept, Rav and Shmuel accepts Rabbi Yossi, then that's all part of the circumference. So Rabbi Yosef comes along and he says that's not a problem. Because although Rav and Shmuel accepted Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, but not hook, line, and sinker, they accepted one of the two chidushim of Rabbi Yossi, which he relies on Rov, but not on the other. So let's explain. Rabbi Yossi used Rubo Kekulo, the reliance on Rov, in two different ways. One of which was accepted by Rav and Shmuel, the other not. Number one, if he cuts most of the trachea, let's say within the Tabas Hagdola, then that's a valid shechita. Even though he didn't completely sever the Tabas Hagdola, but nevertheless he did Rov. Then Rabbi Yossi went a step further and he said about the other tabos, the shar tabos, the lower tabos, that even though they only surround most of the trachea, nevertheless they are considered within the circumference of shechita because of Rov. Because they, like a horseshoe, like we said before, they surround most of the trachea. And Rav and Shmuel rejected that second Kiddush. They held that Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda went too far when he applied Ruba Kukulo, even to define, that biological ring in the trachea as being part of the circumference of Shechita. That they didn't accept. So the Gemara asks the following kasha: V'hol lo omar ka'amri. Right? If we go back to the language here, it says that Afra. This is a quote from Rav and Shmuel. Afra b'Yossi b'Yehuda lo omar elad tabas hagdola. So they were defining Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda's statement in a way that if he shechted beyond the tabas hagdola into the smaller tabos, what we call the lower rings, which don't completely surround, then it would not be a kosher shechita. So Gemara interprets this and says, Hachikam, what they really were saying was, halacha kamosa tabas hagdola, which would mean that if he shechted most of the tabas hagdola but didn't completely sever that cartridge, then it would still be a kosher shechita. But as far as the other rings are concerned, the lower rings, which don't completely surround the trachea, that we don't accept. Ki solik Reb Zera. Reb Zera came from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. That's very important. Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. Keep that in mind. Achal mugmeres de Rav Ushmuel. Meaning, he relied on the expanded circumference of Shechita of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda against Rav and Shmuel. Amri lay, so everybody came to him and said, Lav me asr de Rav Shmuel. You come from Bavel. And if you come from Bavel, the kings in Bavel are Rav and Shmuel. They are the ones who determine halacha. So how can you come here to Eretz Yisrael and completely shake yourself off from Rav and Shmuel? Amalahu man amra. Who is the one who interpreted Rav and Shmuel in that way? It was Yosef Bar Chia, right? We called him Rav Yosef. It doesn't say Bar Chia, but I guess he's the son of Chia. And Yosef Bar Chia Mikuli Alma Gomir? Who did he learn this from? Was Yosef Bar Chia a student of Rav and Shmuel that he heard it directly from Rav and Shmuel? Shomer of Yosef heard about the fact that Reb Zera was kind of being mizalzel. He says, Ikbed, he was very peeved about it. He was insulted. Omar, you should know, says Rav Yosef. Ana mikuli alma gemiri. Are you telling me I learned from anybody on the face of the earth? And I rely on their transmission? Ana mi Rabbi Yehuda gemira. I heard it from Rabbi Yehuda. And let's make a character description or projection of Rabbi Yehuda. Afilu b'sfeki de gavra goris. Even if, let's say, Rabbi Yehuda had a doubt, he didn't know exactly who was transmitting this halacha, who was the author of the halacha. Rabbi Yehuda, he would always say that I don't know if it's this one or that one. Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba. Safek Mishmei de Rav, Safek Mishmei de Shmuel. He was very careful and meticulous to tell us that he wasn't certain whether he heard it from Rav, he heard it from Shmuel. We have a quote of Rabbi Yehuda in which he says that when you have a question of a Bechor, and there might be a mum in the Bechor, which means that it's not Royal Mizbeach, and therefore it becomes Mum and Kohen, and we give it to the Kohen, then all we need is 3 people to be matir if there's no mumcha. Meaning, if there's an expert who has a special smicha in Bechoros, which is called Yatir, Yatir Bechor Yatir, but we don't have such a mumcha, we can rely on 3 ordinary people. An expert is required to determine whether a blemish is sufficiently severe to disqualify the animal for being sacrificed on his behalf and rather given to the Kohanim. But if an expert is unavailable and it's absolutely clear to everyone that the blemish is indeed a severe one, then a panel of 3 laymen suffices to declare the animal blemished. And Rabbi Yehuda didn't know whether he heard it from Rav or he heard it from Shmuel, but he said, I don't know, it's either Rav and Shmuel. So anyway, we see that Rabbi Zera, when he got to Eretz Yisrael, he was mekil, and he ate meat that was also, according to Rav and Shmuel, it was treif. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Zera Lesle, does he not have a Mishnah in Masechta Psachim that says, Nosen al chulei makom sheyotzu misham mucher v'chumrei makom shehalach l'sham? So let's say, for an example, this will be relevant, well, it's not so relevant because Yom Tov Sheni this year is on Shabbos. But let's say that Shavuos was on a Sunday, and you have a Chicagoan that comes to Eretz Yisrael for Shavuos. He's going to have to observe Yom Tov on Monday as well, even though here in Israel we only observe the first day of Yom Tov. We don't have a second day of Yom Tov. Israel Chag. But nevertheless, he has to maintain the minhag of makom sheyatza misham. Since in Chicago they have 2 extra days, they have an extra day, Yom Tov Sheni Shagol, so that's what he has to do. So even though Reb Zera came from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, and in Eretz Yisrael they could be mekil and rely on Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, but he came from Bavel, and in Bavel, Rav and Shmuel paskin that this was treif. Omar Abaye, Abaye says that the ruling of the Mishnah that you have to continue the chumrah of Mokom Sheyotze Misham or pick up the chumrah of Mokom Shebolasham, that's only Hanimili be Bavel Bavel. You go from one location, one locale, one district in Bavel to another locale, or Me'eretz Yisrael from one part of Eretz Yisrael to another, or Inami Me'eretz Yisrael Bavel. So if you have a chumrah in Eretz Yisrael, you're not allowed to go into Bavel and say, well, in Bavel and Mekil, I'm going to drop the Chumrah. No, you have to maintain the Makom Sheyatza Misham, that minig of the place you came from Eretz Yisrael. Aval, but the exception to the rule is mi Bavel le'Eretz Yisrael. If you're going from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, then you don't have to maintain the Chumrah of Makom Sheyatza Misham of Bavel. Why? Because Eretz Yisrael has a certain jurisdiction over Bavel. Kevan tanan kaifinilu avdin kavasayu. We can accept the minig of Eretz Yisrael, in which case Reb Zera is allowed to eat from the meat when he comes to Eretz Yisrael, even though in Bavel he would not be allowed to eat the meat because of the Chumrah of Rav and Shmuel, because we are not subordinate in Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. The contrary is true. Bavel is subordinate to Eretz Yisrael. And this has to do with the Gemara in Sanhedrin about, number one, the calendar, right, to determine what day is Rosh Chodesh. That is in the hands of Eretz Yisrael. And there's halacha that ein konsim b'Bavel. This has to do with various kinds of penalties for those who damage others' properties and so forth. That cannot be instituted in Bavel, but only in Eretz Yisrael. So we see that the power of the courts in Eretz Yisrael, the rabbinic courts, are greater than those of Chutz La'aretz, of Bavel. And since in Bavel they're subordinate to Eretz Yisrael, then someone who goes from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael is not required to honor the place that he left and continue those minhagim. So therefore, Reb Zera coming from Chutz La'aretz, from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, could now be making on that meat which in Bavel Rav and Shmuel prohibited. But now I told you that if a person comes from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael for Shavuos, he's going to have to maintain his minog of Yontiv Sheni. The Gemara says, Rav Ashi Omer Afilu Teva Bavel Eretz Yisrael. There are situations in which you can completely drop the minhagim lechumra of Bavel when you come to Israel, because the only time you have to maintain those minhagim because you're coming for Yontiv, but your intention is to go back after Yontiv. But Rabbi Zera ain't daito lachsar. Right? Rabbi Zera came on a plane from Nefesh B'Nefesh, and Baruch Hashem, he made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, which we hope all the Chicagoans will finally get the message and do the same. But that's true not only for Chicago, it's true for the whole world today, right? Get the message. And Reb Zera got the message. In fact, I think the Gemara tells us, I'm trying to remember where, maybe it's going to be here in Chullin, that Reb Zera fasted when he came to Eretz Yisrael to forget his Torah from Bavel and start learning Torah from scratch again. And Reb Zera ain't daito lachsar, and therefore, says Rav Ashi, he's allowed to accept upon himself the minhagim of Eretz Yisrael, completely cut off from the minhagim of Bavel. Amalei Abayler of Yosef, V'ha Rabbanon di Asum Mechos is an area in Bavel, and the rabbis who came from Mechoza, Amri, they used to say, Omer Reb Zera Mishmei Rav Nachman, Mugmeres Kshera. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the words Mugmeres Kshera don't mean that there's no psul of shchita of Hagrama. That's not what it's all about. But rather, the Hagrama of Rav and Shmuel, who are machmir then on a tabas haktana, that lower part of the trachea, that's outside of the circumference of shchita, and therefore it's possible. That's called Mugmeres Kshera. meaning that mugmeris which Rav and Shmuel would passel was considered was kshera according to Abzera. I'm sorry. Omar Abzera made the Rava. He seems to be saying that even in Bavel, right, there were places that were outside the limits of Shechita according to Rav and Shmuel, and yet we can rely on that Shechita. Amalei, Rav Yosef says, no, Naharu Pashta. There were different parts in Bavel, and there were different minhagim, or let's say rules in Bavel, and therefore, although there were places in Bavel where they were makil, like Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, but there were other places where they accepted the chumrah of Rav and Shmuel. Okay. By the way, I'm having a little trouble with the internet. I'm just wondering, just shake your head if you still hear me. Okay, good. Rav Shimon ben Lakish, Achsher b'chuda de kova. Now, again, if we're looking at the trachea, there's a place which is called the point of the helmet. So once again, we have to see that the trachea has a kova on it, so that the tabas hagdola is kind of like on top, and again it circles the entire trachea, and below it there's a certain very like pretty long cartilage which is called a kova. And Reish Lakish goes ahead and he says that even the kova is considered part of the circumference of shechita, and it's valid. And Karle Rabbi Yochanan said, wait a minute, Gisa. You're going too far. That far for sure, the kova is outside the circumference of shechita, and it's possible. And there's a play on words here because Gisa also means a brother-in-law. And Reish Lakish was indeed married to the sister of Yochanan, if you remember the whole story of Bava Metzia. Omar Rav Papi Mishmei de Rava. Okay, the names here are important. This is Rav Papi. And he says in the name of Rava, Poga b'chite treifa. This for sure is treif. The chite is well beyond the tabas hagedola. It's actually like rolls, like round rolls. It's called the corniculate cartilage. Now, what did Rav Papi mean when he said paga b'chiti? The language paga, which refers to the knife of the shechita that met up with these, so to speak, wheat kernels, as they're called, that cartilage. Ibalu paga v'nogaba, did the knife actually touch these chitim? And therefore it's possible. And I'll give you a case where the word paga means touched. Vayifka bo vayomos, right, which is a pasuk in Malachim, and paga means that he actually struck him. And therefore, Rav Papi passes the shechit in a case where the knife actually cut through these chitim, which are called corniculate cartilage. Or maybe he was even more machmer. O dilma paga v'lo naga, meaning even though he never actually touched with his knife that part, which means paga means to approached him, but he didn't touch him, and that's a pasuk in Breishis Perek Lamed Beis. Itmar Omer of Papa Mishmei de Rava. Shear b'chite kshera. So I think what the Gemara is being medayik here is that shear, he left over some of these wheat kernels that he didn't sever it completely, kshera. So I think the Gemara is coming to the conclusion that paga means literally that his knife His knife, his knife cut through these carriages, leaving part of them above the cut, part below. And this is equivalent to a case of meeting and touching the carriages. Omar Rav Amemar Barav Mar Yenuka, Havi Koimna Kamid Rav Chia Bereder of Avyavi Amarli, Shir Bechite Kshera, Omali Ravina Rav Ashi, Omali Rav Shemen Misurba, Ikla Mar Zutrali Asrin Vidora, Shir Bechite Kshera. So there's a whole tradition of Hamoraim who are of the opinion that Shire, that if he left over Bechite Kshera, but Shir Bechite Trefa, I'm sorry, but Mar Bravashi Omar, Paga Bechite Kshera, he didn't actually cut into the chitim, and therefore the animal is kosher because he didn't actually touch the chitim with his knife. But Shir Bechite, but if he left over some of the wheat kernels, that it's not kosher. V'hilchus, so the Gemara says that the halacha is mishipui kova ulamata kshera v'hainu deshir b'chiti. Okay, Mirz Hashem, we'll pick this up tomorrow here on Daf Yutes. So wishing you a Chodesh Tov and a great day. And that's it. Thank you.